My sister made sure everyone at her wedding knew I was the sad single one. She sat me at the leftovers table, introduced me as still searching for love, and let her bridesmaids giggle about my lonely life. But then a mysterious man leaned in and whispered, "Pretend you're with me." What happened next turned her flawless wedding into my flawless revenge. If your family has ever made you feel small for being single, hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma has a wicked sense of timing, because this story proves that the sweetest revenge comes dressed in pure confidence and envy. The Savannah morning air was a tangible thing, a warm, damp towel scented with Confederate jasmine and the rich, dark breath of the earth. Ilara Washington felt it settle on her bare arms as she knelt before a bed of hydrangeas, their burgeoning blue heads heavy with the promise of summer. At 62, her movements were a study in deliberate grace, a slow ballet she had perfected over decades. The worn leather of her gardening gloves felt like a second skin, the familiar weight of the trowel in her hand a comforting extension of her own will. This garden, tucked away behind the wrought iron fence of her historic row house on Jones Street, was her sanctuary. It was more than a collection of plants. It was a living chronicle, a testament to a life cultivated with the same patience and love she afforded the delicate roots of her prize-winning camellias. Every leaf and petal held a story. The climbing rose that snaked its way up the weathered brick of the back wall had been a first anniversary gift from James. Its thorns were wicked, but its blooms were the color of a blushing dawn, a paradox he had found endlessly amusing. The patch of rosemary near the kitchen door was from his mother's garden in the Low Country, its piney scent a constant ghostly reminder of her legendary Sunday dinners. Even the stubborn weeds that pushed their way through the cobblestone path had their place in the narrative. They were a lesson in persistence, a reminder that life, in all its forms, insisted on being seen. For the 10 years since James had passed, this walled Eden had been our most faithful companion. It did not demand conversation, but it listened. It did not offer solutions, but it provided solace. In a city that often felt like a museum of its own past, Ilara's garden was a place where the past was not preserved in amber, but was actively breathing, growing, and changing with her. She was not lonely here. She was simply with. The rhythmic scrape of her trowel against stone was interrupted by the squeak of the mail carrier's cart on the sidewalk out front, followed by the metallic clink of the mail slot on her front door. It was a sound that usually signaled nothing more than the arrival of utility bills, alumni magazines from Spelman, and the endless stream of catalogs promising a younger, brighter future in 5 easy payments. She sighed, pushing herself up with a hand on her knee, the joint protesting with a familiar ache. Wiping a stray smudge of soil from her cheek with the back of her glove, she made her way through the cool, shaded side passage that led to the front of the house. The air inside was still and quiet, smelling of lemon oil and old books. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the parlor window, painted shifting patterns on the polished heart pine floors. There on the floor, beneath the mail slot, lay the usual assortment. A bill from the city, a postcard from a friend vacationing in Martha's Vineyard, and something else. A thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy as a guilty conscience. It lay apart from the others, its sheer opulence a stark contrast to the humble utility of the Daily Post. Her name and address were rendered in shimmering gold calligraphy, each loop and swirl a tiny, ostentatious performance. There was no return address, only a wax seal on the back and interlocking S and T, pressed into a disk of metallic gold. Ilara knew instantly what it was. She picked it up. the cardstock unnaturally smooth and cool against her fingertips. It felt alien in her world of textured, organic beauty, a manufactured perfection that seemed to mock the earned loveliness of her garden. With a sense of weary resignation, she broke the seal. The invitation inside was just as extravagant. Engraved lettering on an even heavier card announced that Mr. and Mrs. David Washington, in conjunction with Dr. and Mrs. Alistair Thornton, requested the honor of her presence at the marriage of their children, Simone Washington and Trevor Thornton. The ceremony was to be held at the Telfair mansion, the reception to follow. The date was a month away. The phrase, "request the honor of your presence," struck her not as a gentle invitation, but as a royal summons. It was a demand for her participation in a spectacle, a world of performative wealth and social maneuvering that felt a universe away from the quiet dignity she had so carefully constructed for herself. It was a world where a woman's value was too often measured by the man standing beside her. The invitation wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a gilded weed, an invasive species threatening to choke the life from the peaceful ecosystem she had so painstakingly nurtured. She laid it on the hall table, its golden gleam catching the light, looking as out of place as a diamond in a handful of rich, dark soil. The phone rang later that afternoon, its shrill summons slicing through the quiet hum of the house. Ilara was in the kitchen washing the last of the lunch dishes, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water. She dried them on a linen towel, her movements unhurried, and walked to the antique telephone table in the hall. The caller ID displayed Simone's name. Ilara took a slow, steadying breath before picking up the receiver, bracing herself. A conversation with her niece these days was like navigating a field of carefully concealed emotional traps. "Auntie Ilara, it's Simone." Her voice was a confection of spun sugar, a manufactured sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. Ilara had seen that look too many times, a bright, brittle smile that didn't match the cool assessment in her gaze. "Simone, dear, how are you?" Ilara kept her own voice level, a calm sea against which her niece's effusive waves would inevitably crash. "Oh, I'm just frantic. Utterly, completely frantic. You have no idea. The caterer is trying to substitute Chilean sea bass for the Dover sole, and Trevor's mother is insisting on gardenias, which you know will just wilt in the June heat. It's a nightmare," she sighed, a dramatic exhalation that suggested a level of suffering reserved for tragic heroines. "But I'm not calling to complain. Did you get it? The invitation?" "It arrived this morning, yes. It's very elegant." Ilara chose the word carefully. It was neutral, polite, and betrayed none of the unease the gilded card had stirred in her. "Oh, good. I was so worried it might get lost. I wanted to call about logistics, really, just to make sure you're all set." There was a slight pause, the verbal equivalent of a drum roll before the main event. "Auntie, I was just thinking it's going to be such a long evening with the ceremony and then the reception and all the dancing. Are you sure you don't want me to arrange for someone to accompany you? I know it can be a bit much to navigate these things on your own. Daddy has so many old friends, lovely gentlemen who would be more than happy to escort you." The words, wrapped in a silken bow of concern, landed like small sharp stones. Arrange for someone, escort you. As if she were a fragile piece of cargo to be managed, a problem requiring a logistical solution. Ilara felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, a slow burning ember of anger she had learned to bank and control over the years. She gripped the receiver a little tighter, her knuckles white. She pictured Simone on the other end of the line, probably pacing her sleek, minimalist condo overlooking Forsyth Park, her brow furrowed in a perfect performance of familial duty. That's very thoughtful of you, Simone, but it's not necessary. I'm quite capable of attending a wedding by myself, Ilara said, her voice betraying none of the storm brewing inside her. Of course you are, Auntie, of course. I didn't mean... It's just that we want you to be comfortable. We want you to have a wonderful time and not feel, you know. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Not feel old and alone, not feel like a reminder of what's missing, not cast a shadow on my perfect day. The conversation meandered on, each sentence a new, subtle jab. Simone offered unsolicited advice on her attire. You should wear that blue dress, the silk one. It's so classic. We don't want you in anything too dated. She spoke of the seating chart as if it were a complex military strategy. I'm trying to figure out the best place for you. I want you to be with people you can talk to so you won't be bored. Every offer of help was a thinly veiled judgment, every expression of concern a confirmation that, in her family's eyes, she was diminished. She was no longer Ilara Washington, the respected librarian, the devoted wife, the woman who could coax life from the stubborn Georgia clay. She was Aunt Ilara, the widow. A noun that had somehow replaced her name, a label that defined her entire existence as an absence. Internally, Ilara was a tempest. She felt the profound weariness of having to fight this same battle over and over, the exhaustion of constantly defending the validity of her own life. She loved this girl, this daughter of her younger brother, but she was wounded by Simone's complete, almost willful inability to see her as a whole person. To Simone, a woman's life was a narrative that required a romantic co-star to be considered a success. Her own story, with its 35 years of a deeply fulfilling first act, was now apparently in need of a rewrite, a new leading man to be shoehorned into the epilogue. Well, I have to run. The florist is on the other line, Simone said finally, her voice already distant, her attention moving on to the next crisis in her perfectly curated production. I'm so glad we're all set. I just want you to be happy, Auntie. We all do. The line went dead. Ilara stood in the silent hall, the receiver still pressed to her ear. The word happy echoed in the space Simone had left behind. They wanted her to be happy, but only in a way they could understand and approve of. A happiness that fit neatly into their photo albums and their social media feeds. A happiness that came with a +1. That evening, the house settled into its familiar nocturnal rhythm. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the gentle hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant sound of a trolley bell from the street outside. Ilara sat in her favorite armchair in the parlor, a room that served as the heart and memory of the home. It was filled not with expensive things, but with meaningful ones. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes of poetry, history, and classic novels, their spines cracked and softened from countless readings. The walls were adorned with art from local Savannah painters and photographs that chronicled a life well lived. On the mantelpiece, amidst a collection of seashells from Tybee Island and a piece of driftwood that looked like a resting seabird, sat the wedding invitation. Its gilded edges and ostentatious seal looked garish and intrusive, a gaudy tourist in a sacred space. Ilara's gaze drifted from the invitation to a silver-framed photograph next to it. It was of her and James, taken 20 years ago at this very spot. They were dressed up for a New Year's Eve party, his arms securely around her waist, her head tilted back in a full-throated laugh at something he must have just said. James. His absence was not a void, but a presence, a warm, quiet hum that resonated in the very bones of the house. He was in the worn spot on the leather of his reading chair, in the faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco in his study, in the way the late afternoon sun slanted across the floor, just as he'd always said it did. She rose from her chair and pulled a heavy, leather-bound album from the bottom shelf. Settling back under the warm glow of the reading lamp, she opened it. Here was their life, captured in glossy squares. James, young and lanky, with a professor's thoughtful eyes, standing proudly beside his first car. Ilara on her graduation day at Spelman, her face alight with fierce intelligence and boundless hope. Their own wedding, a simple affair in her parents' backyard, a world away from the grand production Simone was planning. They looked impossibly young, their hands clasped together as if they knew even then that they were holding their entire world. She turned the pages slowly, letting the memories wash over her. Their partnership had been a conversation that lasted 35 years. He was a history professor at Savannah State, a man who could read the stories etched into the city's architecture as easily as she could read a book. He taught her to see the ghosts of the past in the ironwork of the balconies and the cobblestones of River Street. She, in turn, the head librarian for the city's main branch, had shared her world of words, introducing him to poets he'd never read and novelists who changed the way he saw the world. Theirs was a love built not on grand gestures, but on the steady accumulation of shared moments. Quiet mornings with the newspaper, vigorous debates over dinner, the comfortable silence of two people reading in the same room. It was a complete and total love, and its memory was not a source of lack, but an anchor, a deep and unshakable foundation. It was the reason her standards were so high. She knew intimately what a true partnership felt like. It wasn't an accessory. It wasn't an escort. It was a communion of souls. A pang resonated deep in her chest, but it wasn't the familiar ache of grief. It was something sharper, more acute. It was frustration. Frustration that others, her own family, could look at the rich, complex tapestry of her life, this life woven with threads of love, intellect, sorrow, and resilience, and see only a single unraveling thread, the thread of her widowhood. They saw the end of her story with James as the end of her story. She closed the album and looked again at the photograph of them dancing, his hand firm in the small of her back. She could almost feel his warmth, hear his low chuckle in her ear. What would he say about all this? He would have been furious, she knew, not in a loud, showy way, but with a quiet, intellectual indignation. He would have calmly, methodically, dismantled Simone's condescending logic with the precision of a surgeon. And then he would have looked at Ilara and said, "Go," and show them what a queen looks like when she stands alone. A quiet resolve settled over her, cool and clear as water. She would go to this wedding. She would wear her classic blue dress, not because Simone suggested it, but because James had always loved how it brought out the color of her eyes. She would navigate the evening with the grace and dignity he had so admired in her. She would not go for Simone or for her brother or for the sake of keeping the family peace. She would go for herself. She would go for James. She would stand in that opulent hall as the living, breathing embodiment of the beautiful, complete life they had built together. Her presence would not be an apology for being alone. It would be a statement. The battlefield had been chosen, the summons accepted, and as she prepared for what was to come, she knew she would not be walking into it unarmed. She was carrying the weight and the strength of a great love, and against that, she suspected, no amount of pity or condescension could possibly stand. The drive to the Telfair mansion was a journey through layers of Savannah's history, a path Ilara had traveled countless times. She passed the familiar squares, each a green lung breathing life into the city, shaded by ancient live oaks draped in the Gothic lace of Spanish moss. Tonight, however, the familiar beauty felt different, like the backdrop to a play in which she had been cast in an unwilling role. She had chosen the blue silk dress. It was a deep, resonant shade, the color of the evening sky just before the stars assert themselves. It was simple, impeccably tailored, and it moved with a quiet whisper against her skin. James had bought it for her for their 30th anniversary. "It's the color of your wisdom, Alara," he had said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Wearing it tonight felt like donning a suit of armor, each thread infused with the strength of that memory, a silent rebuttal to the evening's anticipated narrative. The museum stood like a grand, pale dowager, its neoclassical columns glowing under the expertly placed uplighting. Valets in crisp white jackets scurried to and fro, opening doors to gleaming luxury cars. The air was thick with the mingled scents of expensive perfume and the faint, salty tang of the nearby river. As Alara stepped out of her own modest but well-kept sedan, she felt a momentary wave of intimidation. The sheer scale of the event was designed to impress, to announce the union of two families not just as a marriage but as a merger. She handed her keys to a young man who seemed barely old enough to drive and ascended the marble steps, her back straight, her head held high. Inside, the sound washed over her first, a string quartet playing something bright and Vivaldi-esque, the murmur of 100 conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses. The great hall was a sea of pastel silks and dark suits. Massive floral arrangements dominated by the wilting gardenias Simone had lamented released a cloying funereal scent into the air. Her brother David spotted her almost immediately. He was a softer, more pliable version of their father, a man whose desire for a peaceful life often led him to smooth over conflicts rather than resolve them. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of anxious hospitality. "Alara, you made it. You look wonderful. That color is, classic." He kissed her cheek, his own smelling faintly of expensive cologne and champagne. "Come, let me get you a drink. Simone has a table for you right over here." He guided her through the throng, his hand on her elbow a bit too firm, as if he were steering a precious, fragile antique. He was nervous, she realized. Nervous about her, about how she fit into this glittering puzzle. The table was, as she had suspected, in a geographic and social no-man's land. Tucked away near a service entrance, it offered a fine view of the catering staff's comings and goings, but little of the main festivities. Her table mates were a collection of social loose ends. There was a distant cousin from her mother's side, a woman named Loretta, who communicated primarily through pursed lip judgments and side observations about the younger generation. There was a young, painfully shy colleague of Trevor's, an analyst of some sort who looked at his shoes more than at the people around him. And there was a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Albright, a former professor of Trevor's mother, a woman of formidable intellect who seemed to view the entire affair with an air of detached anthropological curiosity. "So, you're the bride's aunt," Loretta began, her voice a low, conspiratorial hum. "The one who lives on Jones Street. Such a lovely house. A shame you're all alone in it." The words were out before David had even fully retreated. Alara gave her a cool, placid smile. "I find it's the perfect size. Any larger and I'd have no time for my garden." Dr. Albright looked up from her program, a flicker of interest in her sharp eyes. "A gardener? A noble pursuit. The cultivation of life requires a patience most people lack." The young analyst simply blushed and took a large gulp of his water. The battle lines, it seemed, were already being drawn even at this forgotten outpost. Ilara settled into her chair, the blue silk of her dress pooling around her, and prepared for a long evening. She was a rooted, patient thing, an ancient oak. She could weather this. As the guests found their seats and the first course, a delicate chilled cucumber soup, was served, Simone began to make her rounds. She was a vision in white, a confection of lace and tulle, her smile as bright and hard as the diamonds at her throat. Trevor trailed in her wake, a handsome, affable man who seemed slightly overwhelmed by the production his fiancée had orchestrated. When they arrived at table 18, the designated island of misfit toys, Simone's smile widened, becoming a caricature of warmth. "Auntie Ilara, I'm so glad you could make it." She bent to kiss the air near Ilara's cheek. "I want you to meet Trevor's parents. Mother, Daddy Thornton, come say hello to my auntie." Dr. and Mrs. Alastair Thornton were a formidable pair. He was a renowned surgeon with a patrician air and eyes that seemed to be conducting a constant, silent diagnosis. His wife, Beatrice, was rail-thin and impeccably dressed, her posture so perfect it looked painful. She appraised Ilara with a quick, sweeping glance that took in the simple dress, the single strand of pearls, and the unadorned hands. "Simone has told us so much about you," Beatrice Thornton said, her voice crisp and cool. It was the kind of voice that could dismiss a person without uttering a single unkind word. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," Ilara replied, her own voice calm and even. She would not be diagnosed or dismissed. Simone placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, a gesture that might have looked affectionate to a stranger, but to Ilara it felt like a brand. "Auntie Ilara is our family's rock," she announced to the Thorntons, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Ever since my Uncle James passed, she's been so incredibly strong. We all worry about her, of course, being on her own, but she's so independent." She said the word independent as if it were a chronic, incurable illness. It was a masterful performance. In a few short sentences, she had defined Ilara for them, tragic, lonely, but brave. A figure deserving of their sympathy, not their respect. Alastair Thornton nodded slowly, his diagnostic gaze softening into one of professional pity. "Grief is a difficult road to walk alone," he pronounced, as if delivering a somber prognosis. "It's good she has family like you, Simone." "We do our best," Simone said with a sigh, squeezing Ilara's shoulder before finally releasing her. "We just want her to be happy." They moved on, a royal procession leaving a wake of condescension. Ilara felt the eyes of the other tables on her. She could see the whispers, the tilted heads, the soft pitying smiles. Simone had not just introduced her, she had curated her. She had presented her to this new, powerful family as a problem they were lovingly managing. The heat rose in her chest again, but she pushed it down, channeling it into a cold, hard resolve. She took a sip of her iced tea, the crystal glass cool against her lips. She thought of James, of his quiet dignity, of his utter disdain for pretense. He would have seen right through Beatrice Thornton's brittle elegance and Simone's saccharine concern. He would have leaned over and whispered a quote from Mark Twain or a dry observation about the sociology of the nouveau riche, and she would have had to stifle a laugh. The memory was a shield. She could feel his presence, a warm weight beside her, and it made her feel less alone than anyone in this crowded, noisy room. Dr. Albright, who had watched the entire exchange with unnerving stillness, leaned toward her slightly. "Your niece," she said, her voice a low murmur, "is a remarkable work of fiction." Ilara almost smiled. Perhaps she had found an ally after all. The evening wore on, a marathon of forced pleasantries and lukewarm Chardonnay. Speeches were made, toasts were offered, and a slideshow of Simone and Trevor's courtship was projected onto a large screen, each photo more glossy and perfect than the last. Ilara maintained her composure, a serene island in a sea of performative joy. She engaged Dr. Albright in a fascinating conversation about the Gullah Geechee culture of the Sea Islands, and even managed to draw the shy young analyst into a brief discussion about the merits of a well-tended garden. She was surviving. Then came the bouquet toss. The DJ, a man with a relentlessly cheerful voice, called for all the single ladies to make their way to the dance floor. It was a ritual Ilara had always found slightly barbaric, a strange, competitive scramble for a symbolic promise. She had no intention of participating. She remained seated, hoping to become invisible. But Simone, it seemed, had other plans. From her position at the edge of the dance floor, the bride scanned the room, her eyes landing directly on table 18. "Auntie Ilara," she called out, her voice amplified by the microphone. "Don't be shy. Get out here. It's tradition." A spotlight, as if on cue, swung to illuminate their table. A smattering of polite, encouraging applause broke out. Loretta nudged her. "Go on, dear. You never know." It was a command, not an invitation. To refuse would be to make a scene, to appear bitter or unsporting. It was a perfectly executed trap. Feeling 100 pairs of eyes on her, Ilara rose slowly and walked toward the dance floor. She felt conspicuous, a solitary gray dove in a flock of brightly colored, twittering birds. The other women were mostly in their 20s. Simone's friends and cousins, their faces alight with excitement and competitive glee. They made a space for her in the center, a gesture that felt less like inclusion and more like exhibition. She stood there, the blue silk of her dress a somber note in a symphony of youthful pastels, and waited. Simone turned, her back to the crowd. She held the bouquet of white roses and wilting gardenias aloft. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes meeting Ilara's for a brief, charged moment. A small, triumphant smile played on her lips. Then, with a theatrical wind-up, she tossed the bouquet. But she didn't throw it high and far into the center of the group. She turned her body slightly and lobbed it with deliberate, gentle precision in the exact opposite direction of where Ilara was standing. A tall, leggy bridesmaid who had been perfectly positioned caught it with ease. The crowd erupted in cheers. The DJ played a triumphant blast of music. But in the brief silence that followed, Ilara heard it, a ripple of laughter. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was the laughter of relief. The sound people make when a moment of potential social awkwardness has been neatly averted. They were laughing because the old aunt hadn't caught it, because the natural order of things had been restored. In that moment, the carefully constructed armor of her composure cracked. The pity, the condescension, the public display, it was too much. This was not just an oversight, it was a calculated act of humiliation, a final public underscoring of her status as the family's resident tragedy. She turned, her face a stoic mask hiding the tremor of rage and hurt within, and walked back to her table. She could feel the pitying gazes follow her, a physical weight on her back. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. That was it. She was done. She would not stay for the cake. She would not stay to watch her niece dance with her new husband. She would slip out quietly, a ghost leaving a party she had never truly been invited to. She reached for her small evening bag on the empty chair beside her. As her fingers closed around the clasp, a low, resonant voice spoke from just behind her shoulder. It was a voice that carried an easy authority, a calm in the surrounding storm. "Act like you're with me." Ilara froze, her hand still on her bag. She turned startled to see a man standing there. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit that spoke of quiet expense rather than flashy wealth. He was perhaps her age, maybe a few years older, with silvering temples and intelligent dark eyes that held a hint of weary amusement. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was kind, and in his gaze she saw not a flicker of pity. She saw only recognition. For a moment, Ilara could only stare. The man's presence was so unexpected, so incongruous with the narrative of the evening, that her mind struggled to place him. He wasn't one of David's friends, nor did he have the look of a Thornton. There was a stillness about him, a self-contained confidence that set him apart from the anxious energy of the wedding party. He pulled out the empty chair beside her, the one she had been using for her bag, a silent testament to her solitary status, and sat down with an unhurried grace. He moved as if he belonged there, as if this had been the plan all along. "I beg your pardon?" Ilara finally managed, her voice a little breathless. He leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the music. "Your niece just spent the better part of the cocktail hour explaining to anyone who would listen how deeply concerned she is for your solitary life. I overheard her telling Beatrice Thornton that she hoped you might find a little happiness before it's too late. I took the liberty of assuming this was not a narrative you co-authored." His eyes, sharp and observant, held hers. There was no mockery in them, only a dry, shared understanding. He had seen it. He had understood it. The simple act of being seen, truly seen, was so startling that it momentarily disarmed her. She found herself giving a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," she whispered, "I did not." "I thought not." He extended a hand across the small table. His hands were large with long, capable fingers. "Julian Croft. I'm an old colleague of Alistair Thornton's. We were residents together in Baltimore a lifetime ago. He invites me to these things out of a sense of duty, and I attend out of a sense of morbid curiosity." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And you are Ilara Washington, the family's rock." He said the words with a delicate irony that stripped them of their condescending power, turning them into a badge of honor. "Ilara," she confirmed, placing her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm. For the first time all evening, she felt a flicker of something other than resignation. It was a spark of defiance. "And how is it you know my name?" "I asked the bartender," he said simply, "after I watched you handle the introduction to the Thorntons with a grace they clearly didn't deserve. And then I watched that performance with the bouquet." He shook his head slightly, a look of distaste crossing his features. "It was a master class in passive aggression. My late wife was a psychologist. She would have had a field day with your niece." The mention of his late wife was dropped into the conversation so naturally, so devoid of self-pity, that it created an immediate, unspoken bond between them. He understood. He knew the landscape of loss, and he knew that it was not a wasteland to be pitied, but a territory to be navigated with strength and dignity. Across the room, Ilara saw Simone's head turn. Her niece was scanning the crowd, her smile momentarily faltering as she saw the scene at table 18. An unknown, distinguished-looking man was now sitting with her aunt, leaning in, their hands still clasped. Simone's eyes narrowed. The confusion on her face was a small, deeply satisfying victory. "She's noticed us," Ilara murmured, withdrawing her hand. "Excellent," Julian said, his voice laced with amusement. "Phase 1 is complete. Now, if you'll permit me, I believe Phase 2 involves a public display of something other than pity." He looked toward the dance floor where the DJ had just transitioned from an upbeat pop song to a slow, classic Etta James ballad. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice a low, gentle invitation. "May I have this dance?" Standing up and walking with Julian toward the dance floor felt like crossing a line. Ilara was no longer a passive observer of her own humiliation. She was an active participant in a new, unfolding drama. She could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The whispers that had followed her back from the bouquet toss started up again, but their tone had changed. The pity was being replaced by a far more potent emotion: curiosity. Who was this man? And what was he doing with the lonely old aunt? Julian led her to a space near the center of the floor. He placed one hand firmly but gently on her waist and took her other hand in his. It had been years since she had danced like this with anyone but James. The muscle memory was there, but the feeling was foreign. Yet, as he guided her into a slow, easy rhythm, a surprising sense of comfort settled over her. He was a good dancer, confident and assured, leading without being overbearing. He moved with the same deliberate grace she cultivated in her garden. "You seem to be enjoying this," she observed, a hint of a smile in her voice. "I despise bullies," he said, his eyes holding hers, "especially the ones who disguise their cruelty as concern." "And besides," he added, a genuine smile finally breaking through his reserved exterior, "it's been a long time since I've had a dance with a beautiful woman who isn't trying to set me up with her recently divorced daughter." Ilara laughed, a real unforced sound that felt like a release. "I promise I have no daughters to set you up with." "Then this is a perfect arrangement," he said. They moved in comfortable silence for a moment, swaying to the soulful lament of the music. Being in his arms felt safe, not in a way that diminished her own strength, but in a way that acknowledged it. It was the safety of an alliance, of having someone in your corner. "Tell me about your garden, Ilara," he said, his voice a low murmur against the music. "Dr. Albright mentioned it." She seemed impressed. And so, in the middle of her niece's opulent wedding reception, surrounded by people who saw her as a one-dimensional tragedy, Ilara talked about her garden. She spoke of the stubborn resilience of the climbing rose James had given her, of the particular shade of blue her hydrangeas turned in the acidic soil, of the peace she found in the simple, honest work of tending to living things. He listened, truly listened, asking intelligent questions, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't try to relate it to his own experience or turn the conversation back to himself. He simply gave her the space to be the expert, to be the passionate, knowledgeable woman she was. Their quiet moment was inevitably interrupted. Simone appeared at their side, her smile stretched so tightly it looked like it might crack. "William? I see you've met my aunt," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. She had apparently gotten his name from someone. "It's Julian," he corrected her gently, without missing a beat in the dance. "And yes, I was just telling Ilara that I knew her husband's work. Professor Washington was a giant in his field. His book on the Reconstruction era in the coastal South is required reading in any serious historical circle. I was sorry I never had the chance to meet him." Simone was momentarily thrown. This was a detail she hadn't anticipated. Her uncle, the quiet academic, was being lauded by this impressive stranger. It didn't fit the narrative. "Oh, yes, Uncle James was very smart," she stammered. "Auntie, would you mind if I borrowed William for a moment? There's some people I'd like him to meet." "It's Julian," he said again, his voice still polite but with a new firm edge. "And actually, I'm quite happy where I am. Perhaps your friends can come to us." He turned his full attention back to Ilara. effectively dismissing the bride at her own wedding. The snub was so elegant, so perfectly executed, that Simone was left speechless. She stood there for a second, her mouth slightly agape, before turning on her heel and stalking away. Ilara watched her go, a storm cloud of white lace and fury. The sweet, satisfying taste of revenge was beginning to bloom. When the song ended, Julian did not lead Ilara back to the social Siberia of table 18. Instead, he guided her toward a much better located table, one that had been occupied by some of Trevor's business associates, who were now mingling at the bar. With a discreet word to a passing waiter and a gesture toward the empty chairs, he had effectively commandeered it. As they sat down, the waiter appeared with a fresh bottle of champagne in an ice bucket. "I took the liberty," Julian said, pouring them both a glass. "I think the occasion calls for it." The change in their social fortunes was immediate and palpable. People who had previously offered Ilara only fleeting, pitying glances now looked at her with open curiosity. Her proximity to Julian had transformed her. She was no longer the lonely widow, she was the intriguing companion of the distinguished stranger. Soon a slow trickle of guests began to make their way to their new table. First, it was Alistair and Beatrice Thornton, their approach a mixture of social obligation and genuine inquisitiveness. "Julian, it's been too long," Alistair said, shaking his hand. "I didn't realize you knew Simone's aunt." "We have mutual interests," Julian said smoothly, his eyes twinkling as he looked at Ilara. "Ilara was just telling me about her remarkable garden." Beatrice Thornton, who had dismissed Ilara with a single glance earlier, now looked at her with a new, calculated interest. "A garden? How lovely. Alistair and I are on the board of the city's botanical society." Suddenly, Ilara was no longer an object of pity, but a potential social asset. She found herself drawn into a conversation about heritage roses and the challenges of cultivating orchids in the humid savanna climate. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who possessed deep, practical knowledge, and she saw a flicker of genuine respect in Beatrice's cool eyes. Next came some of Trevor's colleagues, the ones who had been at the table before. They were drawn back by Julian's presence, and he expertly included Ilara in their conversation about market trends and investment strategies. To their surprise, she contributed an insightful comment about the economic history of the port of Savannah, a piece of knowledge gleaned from one of James's old research papers. She saw their surprise, the subtle recalibration in their minds, as they were forced to see her as more than just an old woman in a blue dress. The ultimate proof of the shift came in the form of her brother David. He approached the table looking flustered and confused. "Ilara, Simone said you'd met an old friend of the Thorntons." "I have," Ilara said, her voice serene. She introduced him to Julian. "A pleasure," Julian said, shaking David's hand. "Your sister is a remarkable woman. You must be very proud of her." David looked from Julian to Ilara, a dawning understanding on his face. He was seeing his sister, perhaps for the first time in a long time, through a stranger's eyes. He was seeing not the fragile widow who needed protecting, but a poised, intelligent, and desirable woman holding her own in the center of the room. "Yes," he said slowly, a note of awe in his voice. "Yes, I am." From across the room, Ilara could see Simone watching them. Her niece was standing with a group of her bridesmaids, but her attention was fixed on their table. Her face, even from a distance, was a mask of controlled fury. Every guest who stopped to speak with Ilara and Julian, every laugh they shared, every respectful nod Ilara received, was a stone being removed from the foundation of Simone's perfectly constructed day. The spotlight had shifted. The narrative was no longer hers to control. and the quiet, pathetic aunt she had tried so hard to manage had, with the help of an unexpected ally, become the most intriguing woman in the room. The ceremonial cutting of the cake, a towering 7-tiered confection of white fondant and sugar flowers, signaled the beginning of the evening's final act, the speeches. The best man, a boisterous former fraternity brother of Trevor's, delivered a rambling, joke-filled tribute that was more about his own glory days with the groom than about the couple themselves. Then the maid of honor, Simone's best friend since childhood, gave a tearful, saccharine speech about their lifelong friendship, filled with inside jokes and declarations of sisterly love. Throughout it all, Ilara sat with Julian, a silent observer. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a film whose ending she already knew. Finally, it was Simone's turn. She rose, champagne flute in hand, and tapped it gently with a manicured nail. The room fell silent. She was radiant under the soft lighting, the perfect bride, her face a carefully composed mask of happiness. She thanked their parents, their guests, and her wonderful new husband. Then her eyes swept the room and landed, as Ilara knew they would, on her. "I also want to take a moment to thank my family," Simone began, her voice thick with practiced emotion, "especially my wonderful, strong Auntie Ilara." A murmur of sympathetic approval went through the crowd. "Many of you know that my aunt lost her husband, my dear Uncle James, some years ago, and ever since then she has been such an inspiration to me. She has faced her life with so much courage." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Courage in the face of what? Loneliness, pity, a life half lived. "I've always looked out for my auntie," Simone continued, her gaze still locked on Ilara. "And I've worried about her. All I've ever wanted is for her to find the kind of happiness that Trevor has brought me, to find someone to share her life with so she won't have to be alone." She raised her glass. "So tonight I want to make a special toast to my Aunt Ilara. May you one day find a love that makes you as happy as I am tonight. We are all rooting for you." It was a breathtakingly cruel move, disguised as a loving tribute. In front of everyone, she had once again painted Ilara as a lonely spinster, a project to be fixed, a life incomplete. She had reduced her to a single pathetic wish. The guests, oblivious to the subtext, smiled and raised their glasses. "To Ilara," they murmured. Felt like a death sentence. Ilara could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But then she felt Julian's hand cover hers on the table, his touch a silent, steadying anchor. He leaned over, his lips close to her ear. "The Queen's Gambit," he whispered, "an aggressive opening. Now, we respond." Before the DJ could restart the music, before the moment could pass, Julian stood up. He was a tall, commanding presence, and his simple act of rising was enough to keep the room's attention. He still held his champagne flute. "If I may," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent hall. "As a friend of the Thornton family and as a new admirer of the Washingtons, I'd like to add a few words to that beautiful toast." Simone, still standing at the head table, looked momentarily confused, then pleased. She clearly assumed this distinguished man was about to add his own praise to her performance. Alistair and Beatrice Thornton looked on with interest. "Simone spoke of her aunt's courage," Julian began, his eyes sweeping the room before coming to rest with profound warmth on Ilara. "And she is right, but I suspect many of you may be misinterpreting the nature of that courage. It is not the courage of a woman enduring loneliness. It is the courage of a woman who knows the profound difference between being alone and being lonely." A subtle shift occurred in the room. The tone was not what they expected. I did not have the honor of knowing Professor James Washington personally, Julian continued, his voice resonating with intellectual authority. But like anyone with a serious interest in American history, I have known his work for decades. He was a man of towering intellect and profound integrity. He didn't just write about history, he sought to understand the very soul of it. A man of that caliber does not choose a partner of lesser substance. He turned his body slightly, a speaker addressing his true subject. To have built a life with such a man, to have been his partner in a 35-year conversation of intellect and love, is not a tragedy that leaves a woman empty. It is a privilege that makes her whole. It sets a standard. The courage Alara Washington displays is the courage to honor that standard, the courage to refuse to diminish a great love by accepting a lesser one out of fear or convenience. It is the courage of self-worth. The room was utterly still. He had taken Simone's narrative and not just refuted it, but elevated it into something beautiful and powerful. He had transformed Alara from an object of pity into a subject of profound respect. Simone, he said, turning his gaze to the head table. His voice was gentle, but his words were a surgeon's scalpel. You wished for your aunt the happiness you have found. It is a generous wish. But the happiness of a life deeply lived, of a mind richly cultivated, of a love profoundly known, that is a happiness she already possesses. It is not a future she is waiting for. It is a foundation upon which she stands. He raised his glass high. So, I would like to amend the toast, not to Alara's future, but to her present, to a woman of substance, grace, and a wisdom our world desperately needs, to Alara Washington. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The air in the room was thick with the weight of Julian's words. Then Alistair Thornton, the renowned surgeon, a man not easily impressed, rose to his feet and raised his glass. To Alara, he said, his voice booming with a newfound genuine respect. Beatrice, his wife, stood as well, her cool composure broken by a look of dawning admiration. Then, table by table, the guests began to stand. Dr. Albright from table 18 was one of the first, a wide, appreciative smile on her face. Even the shy young analyst stood, his eyes finally lifted from his shoes. The room erupted in applause. It was not the polite, perfunctory applause from before. It was warm, heartfelt, and aimed directly at Alara. She sat stunned at the center of it all, a wave of vindication so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. She looked at Julian, who gave her a small private wink before taking his seat. The checkmate was complete. Simone was left standing at the head table, her perfect smile frozen on her face. The toast had been to Alara, but the applause felt like a judgment on her. She had tried to play the part of the loving, concerned niece, and this stranger had exposed it for the hollow performance it was. He had done it without being rude, without raising his voice, without revealing a single one of her petty cruelties. He had simply told a better, truer story. Trevor looked at his new wife with a confused, slightly troubled expression. Her parents, the Thorntons, were looking at her with something else entirely: disappointment. Their new daughter-in-law had just been publicly revealed as a person of shallow judgment and questionable character. The rest of the evening was a blur for Alara. The DJ, sensing the shift in mood, put on a lively song, but the energy had changed. The focus of the room had been irrevocably altered. People came to their table not to offer condolences, but to offer congratulations. They wanted to talk to Alara, to hear her story, to be near the quiet strength Julian had so eloquently illuminated. She was no longer a footnote at her niece's wedding. She was the guest of honor. Simone did not approach her again. She spent the rest of the evening plastering on her bridal smile, dancing with her husband, and pretending that the ground had not just crumbled beneath her feet, but Alara could see the cracks in her facade. The perfect day she had spent a year and a small fortune planning had been hijacked. Her attempt to use her aunt as a prop to highlight her own perfect life had backfired in the most spectacular, public way imaginable. She had been upstaged, not by a younger, prettier rival, but by the quiet, unshakable dignity of the very person she had sought to diminish. The queen had been toppled, not by a pawn, but by another queen who had simply been reminded of her own power. An hour later, as the party began to thin, Alara knew it was time to leave. She had no desire to witness the bitter end of Simone's ruined celebration. She wanted to hold on to the feeling of this quiet, unexpected victory, to carry it home with her and let it settle into the foundations of her house. Julian seemed to sense her thoughts. "Shall we?" he asked, rising from his chair. He walked with her through the grand hall, past the wilting gardenias and the remnants of the seven-tiered cake. No one tried to stop them. Her brother David caught her eye from across the room and gave her a small, complicated nod, a look that was equal parts apology and awe. Ilara simply nodded back. There would be time for conversations later. The Savannah night air was a welcome balm after the overheated ballroom. The scent of jasmine was stronger now, and a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky. The valets, seeing them approach, scurried to retrieve their cars. "My car is just here," Ilara said, stopping beside her sedan. She turned to face him in the soft glow of the streetlights. "Julian, I don't have the words to thank you." "No thanks are necessary," he said, his expression serious. "I only said what was true. It was a privilege to be your ally tonight." "It was more than that," she insisted. "You gave me back my voice." "You never lost it, Ilara. It was just waiting for a quiet moment to be heard." He paused, a flicker of uncertainty in his usually confident eyes. "This evening began as a strategic intervention, but it did not end that way for me. I find myself hoping this is not the last time we'll speak." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. On it was his name, Julian Croft, MD, and a phone number. "I'm in Savannah for another month, consulting at the hospital. If you would be amenable, I would very much like to take you to dinner, a proper one. No pretense, no revenge, just conversation." Her heart, which had been beating a steady, calm rhythm all evening, gave a surprising little flutter. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time, a ghost of a sensation from a life she thought was long past. She took the card, its crisp edge a tangible promise. "I would like that very much, Julian." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Good." He did not try to shake her hand or kiss her cheek. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer, a look of profound respect passing between them, and then turned to the valet who had arrived with his car. Ilara watched him drive away, then got into her own car, the small white card feeling as heavy and significant as a key in her hand. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was David. His voice was subdued, stripped of its usual forced cheerfulness. "Ilara, can we talk?" He came over that afternoon, sitting not in the formal parlor, but at the small table in her sun-drenched kitchen. He stumbled through an apology for Simone, for himself, for not seeing how they had treated her. "We were wrong, Ilara. I was wrong. I was so busy trying to make sure Simone had her perfect day that I didn't stop to think about what it was costing you. That man, Julian, he made me see. He made me see you the way I used to before James was gone." It was a difficult, honest conversation. Ilara didn't absolve him easily. She spoke of her hurt, of the years of subtle condescension, of the pain of being defined by her loss rather than by her life. He listened, and for the first time he seemed to truly hear. It was not a complete healing, but it was the lancing of a wound, the first step towards something healthier. Simone did not call. She arrived unannounced a week after the wedding. She stood on Ilara's doorstep, dressed not in bridal white, but in severe dark trousers and a silk blouse. Her face was pale, and the brittle confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, defensive anger. "I suppose you're very pleased with yourself," she began, storming past Ilara into the hall. "Shouldn't I be?" Ilara asked calmly, closing the door. "You ruined my wedding. You and that man. You made me look like a fool in front of my new family." "No, Simone," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "You did that yourself. I was merely the mirror you chose to perform in front of." They stood in the parlor, the gilded invitation still sitting on the mantelpiece like a piece of evidence. Simone's anger finally crumbled, revealing the confused, insecure girl beneath. "I don't understand you," she said, her voice cracking. "Why would you want to be alone? Why wouldn't you want what I have?" Ilara looked at her niece, at this young woman who had been raised in a world of surfaces, of Instagram filters and curated perfection, and felt a pang of something like pity. "What you have is lovely, Simone, but it is not the only way to have a life. I am not alone. This house is full. It's full of my memories, my books, my garden. It's full of the love James and I built, a love that is still here, still nourishing me. What I wanted from you, from all of you, was not a +1. It was just respect. The respect for a life that is different from yours, but no less complete." The conversation did not end with hugs or tears of repentance. It ended quietly, with a chasm of understanding still between them. But as Simone left, she paused at the door and looked back at the photograph of Ilara and James on the mantel. For the first time, she seemed to see it not as a symbol of what her aunt had lost, but of what she had possessed. It was a start. 3 months later, the savannah air had turned crisp with the promise of autumn. The blue hydrangeas in Ilara's garden had faded to a delicate, papery lavender, and the camellias were covered in tight, glossy buds waiting for the first chill to bloom. The garden was not ending. It was simply changing, entering a new season of a different kind of beauty. Ilara was on her knees, tending to a bed of late-blooming asters when the garden gate creaked open. Julian walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee from a nearby cafe. He had been a quiet, steady presence in her life since the wedding. Their first dinner had turned into a second, and then a weekly tradition of long walks through the city's squares, of visits to museums, of comfortable silences spent reading in the same room. He did not try to fill the space James had left. He created his own. He handed her a cup and sat on the low stone bench watching her work. "The Thorntons send their regards," he said with a wry smile. "Beatrice is still trying to recruit you for the Botanical Society's board." Ilara laughed, wiping a smudge of dirt from her nose. "Tell her I'm too busy with my own board of directors." She gestured to the plants around her. They sat together as the afternoon sun slanted through the branches of the live oak, the light golden and mellow. Her life was not what her family had planned for her, nor was it a story that would fit neatly into a wedding slideshow. It was quieter, more complex, and infinitely richer. The revenge she had exacted at the wedding had been sweet, but it had been a fleeting pleasure. The real victory was this, the quiet affirmation of her own worth. It was the freedom to stand in her own garden, a place cultivated by a great love from her past, and welcome a new and unexpected friendship into her present. She was not waiting for happiness. She was living it on her own terms in a life that was gloriously, completely, and unapologetically her own.